Hello there, my name is David Summerhays, and today I'm going to present the very basics of piano tuning. Not how to tune a piano, but rather sort of what's the very basic theory behind how pianos are tuned. You're going to be learning something that a lot of piano tuners don't know, and these are professionals of the piano. It's something I've been presenting to a lot of my students. Whenever somebody owns a piano, I try to explain to them what they should be asking for from their piano tuner. So this explains all of that, but it's a little bit more than that. It's even if you don't own a piano, many people have found that what I'm presenting helps people hear music differently, hear it better, but also want to explore music in a different way. So this is some pretty specialized knowledge, but very neat stuff. And I think a lot of people will learn something. So we'll use the, shall we say, the overabundance of musical instruments in my home to help with this. Really, the big takeaway point that I'm making here is that if you own a piano and you're having it tuned, ask your tuner to not tune your piano in equal temperament. Ask them for something better than that. Well, the first thing is that a couple of centuries ago, musicians would be saying that equal temperament is ugly. So it's, I know that sounds lovely. To our modern ears, we've gotten used to that kind of sound. But a few centuries ago, they would have found that the sound wasn't as pure as they liked. So I'll define that a little bit more in a moment and try to help people hear it. But even more importantly than the lack of purity in the way that the piano is tuned, actually, ironically, many composers would find that equal temperament is also too pure. So it's at the same time not pure enough and also too pure. So I'll go over that in a moment. But basically, in a word, the modern piano tuned in equal temperament lacks expression, and that's that. And if we look at the music of like Chopin, Frédéric Chopin, we really see why. So we'll get into this in a moment. But first, let's just talk about the very basics of tuning using objects. Now, every object in the universe resonates at a particular frequency, and it depends on the type of object and the size of object and how it's, like what material it's constructed out of and so forth. So as we can see, these two glasses ring in two different tones. I don't know if you're getting that, but let me make sure I've got that here. Okay, because of their size. And what happened was that the early Greeks, notably Pythagoras, noticed that there are some mathematical laws to how all of this works. So if we take a single string, like the badly tuned A string on this ukulele, so if we, I should really tune that. So if we do that, supposedly A, and what the Pythagoreans noticed was that if we cut the A in half, so I'm holding it at the halfway point, and play a note, it sounds like the same note, it's just higher. So lower it's that, and this one it's here. So it's, in a way, the same note, like that. So it sounds like the same note, just higher. And what we learned centuries later is that when two notes are an octave apart, that's what it's called when it's the same note, but just higher or lower. It's called an octave difference or a 2-octave difference or more than, depending on how much higher or lower it is. What we learned is that the hertz are double. So if this is A440, then this is A880, and this is A220. So, and what that means is that it's resonating, the air is vibrating at 220 hertz per second, or 440 hertz per second, or 880 hertz per second. And rather than just sounding like clattering in our human ear in the psychoacoustics, that sounds like a note. And so what's interesting is that if we have an object, it'll, like that's a B, this glass will resonate with that B. So when there are videos of people singing and breaking glass, you can look this up on YouTube. I'll try to leave a link in the description to a video. it's not just the fact that the person sang at the glass at a high pitch that made it break, but they also found the resonance of the glass. And if they sing at that pitch in particular, the glass will resonate more. Now, another thing to point out is that when I slice this note in half and I play it, so we have the lower A, the A an octave higher. Well, if I'm off by just a tiny amount, it's off. So there are mathematical proportions that need to be precise. So that's precise because the fret on my ukulele is at the precise point that cuts it in half. But the moment I put my finger beyond that, you can see how these small amounts of differences with my finger, I'm not moving it very much, change how pure, or change the note and change how pure it's going to be. And by the way, the other half of that string rings at the same octave. What the Greeks noticed was that if they cut a note into very simple proportions, it was the most harmonious. So if you cut it in half, it makes an octave. If you cut it into 2/3, it makes a fifth. And then if you cut it into 3/4 or 1/4, it's a fourth. Okay, and so on and so on. And also, one of the simplest proportions is cutting it into, I believe it's 4/5 equals a third. And that's also very harmonious. Okay, so that's the basics of resonance. One last basic concept to tell you about. It's something in music called beats. And what that means is that beats are pulsation. It's waves that are canceling each other out and then reinforcing each other and then canceling each other out. And it ends up being a wah, 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 wah sound. And that's why that sound goes whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, so that's the last concept you need to understand before we start talking about how to tune a piano and what this all has to do with the piano. So the first thing to say is that for whatever reason, if we stack a bunch of fifths on top of each other, if we start at C, G, D, A, E, so let's say we just create a series of perfect fifths. And so what we do is we can tune them. We can tune by ear, listening to make sure that the fifth is perfect. We can cut strings into perfect proportions. But what happens is if we stack of those fifths on top of each other, we end up with C to E. If we stack 4/5 on top of each other, 1, 2, 3, 4, we end up at an E. And the weird thing is that when you do that, if you stack 4 perfect fifths on top of each other, you end up with a third that isn't perfect. It isn't pure. In other words, we said that a third was 4/5, I believe is the proportion. Well, if we stack several perfect fifths on top of each other, we don't end up with a perfect third. It's slightly off. And so some tuning systems in the Renaissance wanted to keep the third as perfect as possible. And so they would compromise the fifths in order to, they would make them slightly flat in order to make the third pure. So this is the first math problem that we see with tuning. But in theory, it's not necessary. If we have an instrument like a flute or like a recorder, which is in theory, let's say, based on just the C scale. And so all you really need is a perfect third, a perfect fifth, a fourth, a sixth, you can make them all just. And just means that it's perfectly in proportion at the proportions I mentioned. So like a perfect octave, a perfect fifth, perfectly 2/3, perfectly 3/4. It just means that the proportions are perfect. You can do that if we're in one key. Or if you use a historical instrument like a harpsichord, it's easy to reach in and just tune it. So what historical harpsichordists would do was if they knew that the next piece was going to be an A, they would reach in and they would tune their harpsichord during the concert into the pitch of A. because it had far fewer strings and it was a lot easier to tune. There was also much less tension in the harpsichord than there is on the modern piano. On the modern piano, that's why it's made of cast iron. It's because there's tons and tons of tension on those steel strings. Much less so in the harpsichord, which is mostly made of wood. So because on the piano and let's say like the ukulele, we can't be moving the frets around, or the guitar, we need to make compromises in advance. And that's the first one, is that we kind of need to decide if we're gonna be only in one key, like C, we can make everything just. But the moment we want to start moving around, we can't quite as much. Like I mentioned, there's that first compromise between the fifths and the pure third. And by the way, this isn't a problem on violins or anywhere somebody can make micro adjustments to say, oh, that fifth is almost perfect. Let me just move my finger slightly up or down, and now it's a perfect fifth. So violins don't have this problem. Like I said, it's only a problem when there's fixed notes. But in the Western music scale, like I mentioned, every octave, you're doubling the number of hertz. But within each octave, we're dividing those notes by into 12 intervals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And we're back at the octave, which is an octave higher, at double the hertz. And by the way, as long as that division is even, like every half note or every whole note is the same, it's known as a mean tone. So we found a kind of way of finding an average note between them, or some way of having like a fixed amount that, like for instance, if we make all of the fifths, if we compromise them a set amount to make the third pure, that's also a mean tone. So it's kind of a way of finding an average, a very even way of moving up from octave to octave. But part of the point that I'm kind of trying to make is that if we make the C, E, G pure, which you can set the C as the bass note, make the third pure, and make this fifth pure and the octave pure. Other notes are gonna sound bad. You know, if we play it in F or even F sharp, it's gonna start sounding a little bit more off. So this is another way that if we divide the octave in the way that we traditionally do in Western music, we have to make compromises, unless we're just going to play in C, or we can reach in and tune the instrument. But if we're going to just tune it and forget about it, like we do with the guitar or ukulele or piano or organ, we have to make compromises. So it's called tempering. So we're making the fifth less pure, we're making the third less pure, so that we can move from key to key and then other keys are usable. Now in a lot of historical music, especially up to the Renaissance, basically, and this is why I suspect that much of Mozart's music was only written in about 6 keys when there's 12 on the piano, it's because many of the keys weren't usable. So what they did was they made the C as pure as possible, but then they would make other notes practically unusable. Now, to me, that's usable. That's not bad enough, but I'll insert some sounds into this video that show like an unusable note. It's called a wolf tone. Because it sounds like it's howling like a wolf. It's just going, it's really bad. So Mozart was avoiding those by staying only in a couple of keys. However, in modern Western music, we expect to be able to play Happy Birthday in any key that you want. We expect jazz to move around suddenly and surprisingly from key to key. And so we can't accept not being able to use, half the keys on the keyboard. We need our, we expect notes to sound a little bit more harmonious. And if we use only a just scale, basically it's the more some keys are pure, the more off other keys are going to be. And so that's what, that's basically the main dilemma of temperament, of tuning. It's that the more one key is pure, the more others are going to be off. And there's kind of like a set amount that we're tempering fifths, thirds, and we're playing with all these things in order to come up with a result in different ways. And that's what a temperament is. It's basically various solutions to the problem of how to divide these notes to get the maximum of harmoniousness, but also the maximum of being able to move around from different keys. And obviously, what I'm trying to tell you is that equal temperament is not a good compromise. It's a compromise that I do not recommend. So let's get into why. So first, what is equal temperament? Equal temperament means, I mentioned that we're doubling the hertz, number of hertz between every octave. A440, A880, A220, A110. And what we do in equal temperament is basically just take this doubling of notes, divide it by 12 evenly among the notes. Okay? And so that's what equal temperament is. And so 12 semitones later, we arrive at an octave, which is twice as large. So in equal temperament, nothing is pure. So I know to our ears that we're used to it, but several centuries ago, if we played a modern piano, people would say, ooh, doesn't sound very good, because they were used to their fifths and thirds being extremely pure in some keys, and then very, very off in other keys that they rarely used. Or if they were going to use it, they would quickly reach in, retune their harpsichord, and continue on their way. But not just that, the fifths are a little bit flat, and the fourths are even more sharp. And the thirds are extremely sharp. It's around here. Maybe, let me move up a third. Maybe here. Maybe around there. So it's going, so there's beats there. It's going, whoa, very, very fast, as opposed to a third that's a little bit more pure. Like, that's a lot more pure. It's a lot closer to a pure or just third. So that's going whoa, 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 whoa. That's the beat rate that it's going at. So it sounds much more pure than this one, which is going whoa, 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 whoa. It's going pretty fast. But anyway, so in equal temperament, every single key is just as pure or not as every other key. But so let me say a few words about what we want out of a temperament, or what we want out of music. And I think it'll be a little more clear why equal temperament is really not the best solution. So what we want out of music is basically tension and release. That's what music is all about. There's a chord, so there's dissonance, there's some kind of threat, there's some kind of like, more painful note, and then there's its resolution. And that's what makes music pleasing, is that there's a sense that there's a movement. It's not just all harmony, but it's not all dissonance. There's a tension and release, and that's what makes music cathartic. And basically, tension and release also means contrast. But our music can be more surprising if it moves in surprising directions. So part of what makes Mozart boring to listen to, I think, on a modern piano in equal temperament, is that not only does Mozart not really explore, half the keys on the keyboard the way Bach did with his equal temperament, but because we tune it in equal temperament, all of the purity of Mozart is gone. That I believe that Mozart used a mean tone temperament, like a more historic temperament that was more pure. And so all the purity of Mozart is gone, but all of the explosive sort of surprise chords are also much less surprising and much less present in Mozart. And so because it's an equal temperament, it gets evened out, and there's much less contrast, much less tension and release, and much less flexibility. Mozart isn't doing crazy, crazy like chord changes like that. It tends to be very kind of music. And so what we want out of music is expression as well. In other words, we want the instrument, like a piano is just hammering a string. And so what we want is to get the most expressiveness out of this. Unlike a violinist, we can't create swells in a note, or get louder, softer in as easy a way. So we need to maximize the expressiveness and communication we can get out of the piano. So just to say that the advantages of equal temperament are that it's very, very even. Everything is even. Everything is the same. And one of the advantages, obviously, is that all notes and intervals are usable, which is a huge advantage. And just to mention that equal temperament is a feat of science and also technical prowess of piano tuners, of your piano technician. So first of all, it took, spectrometry to really make equal temperament happen. It took the ability to see that what people thought was equal before, people thought that their 19th century Victorian tuning was an equal temperament. It took spectrometry to say, no, this interval is beating too much faster than that other interval in order for that to be a true equal temperament. And so it is a feat of science to be able to scientifically tune instruments, even have the theory to understand on a mathematical level what we need to do to arrive at a true equal temperament, and then have the equipment to say, nope, that's not a true equal temperament. We're off by some slight imperceptible amount. And then after that, even after equal temperament was kind of invented in the early 20th century, maybe late 19th century, if you listen to old recordings, 2 out of 3 of them, as a piano tuner, I can hear that piano is way out of tune, is not well tuned. And so there was also quite a bit of work among piano tuners to be able to tune equal temperament properly. And that's not just electronic tuning devices, but those helped. But also the Piano Guild, really getting its act together and saying, we need a test because people that say that they are professional piano tuners aren't doing equal temperament. So equal temperament is the hardest temperament to tune because it's very demanding to be so precise. So it is a feat of prowess, and there is, half a century of music that's written with equal temperament in mind. And so that's another advantage of equal temperament, is that for some of that music can be improved by using other temperaments, even if the composer didn't have that in mind. But it's not the case for all music. So there is some music that might sound better in equal temperament, but that tends to not be what we would call music. Anyway, that's half joking, maybe half not though. But the disadvantage of equal temperament is that it's like walking through a mowed lawn more than it is walking through a forest. In other words, everything is so equal and so even, and there's so little dissonance possible with an equal temperament that the tension and release is a little bit mowed, and classical composers were using that tension and release, but also jazz pianists can use it. Even if they didn't have, even if many jazz pianists had equal temperament in mind, by just adding a little bit of color, a little bit more unevenness, a lot of their music can be improved. And there's no way to convince you that then, well, I'll put some samples in the description, but we have to hear it for ourselves. But as a piano tuner, I highly, highly recommend scoping this out and asking your piano to be tuned in something else. But we'll get to that in a moment. Another disadvantage of equal temperament, like I said, is that everything is tempered. So nothing is pure, nothing's even very close to pure. So even though there's a lack of, everything is usable and that's good, but nothing is even close to pure, and nothing's very close to dissonant either. It's all just even. Like I mentioned, musicians a few centuries ago would have found that ugly. But also because it's so clean and even, it loses expressiveness. So Chopin wrote in the extreme sharps and flats, which in Mozart's day or before would have been unusable because those were keys that were too dissonant to be used. But Chopin wrote in them because he liked the singing quality of, do you hear that? More than, that doesn't have the wah, 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 wah. That's more like wah, 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 wah. So it's simpler, but this sounds like an operatic voice, right? So Chopin was using that expressiveness, or as another example of how Chopin used it, he used this third, which is kind of like a drum roll in the Funeral March. So it's, those are just stacked fourths and fifths, so it's very pure. And then, Okay, so Chopin is using that dissonance to create kind of a dum, brrr, brrr, like a drum section. Okay, it's not so dissonant that it's painful, but it's just he's using that expressiveness to either get the singing, get that human voice quality out of the instrument, or other effects like a drum. Like a bit of a drum roll in the music. So Equal Temperament, because it's so clean, it loses this expressiveness that Chopin, Brahms, Beethoven, they intended the piano to be more dissonant than the modern Equal Temperament. And so we lose that connection to these composers with Equal Temperament. And just to say that basically there's a musical tradition that different keys have different characters. C major, my piano's tuned in Thomas Young well-temperament right now. C major is more pure, calm, just simple. Whereas F sharp is going to be more of a painful key. F minor will tend to be much more sad. There we go. So those will tend to be the bitter keys. F minor, E flat minor, B flat minor. So they're just traditional, like B flat tends to be more trumpety, major. And so on. So there are meanings to different keys. If I recall the American National Anthem is in B flat, for instance, much more trumpet-like. So those are just examples of the traditional character or colors. That's the technical term. When each key has slightly different character, and it's not just even, all the fifths are the same, all the thirds are the same, but when different keys have slightly different character, that's known as color, and that is extremely interesting and rich on a piano. So, what my recommendation, if you're playing historical music and you own a piano and someone is coming to tune it, ask for Thomas Young's well-temperament. Thomas Young's well-temperament, my friend Carl Radford, who's a much more experienced piano tuner than me and has looked into this much more, believes that the Thomas Young well-temperament is basically the most balanced. There's some keys that are not fully pure, but pure enough to be much more pure than an Equal Temperament, and so much more appropriate for like Mozart or Haydn or even Bach when Bach is writing in C. So it's a well-temperament means that every key has color, but every key is usable. That's what well-temperament means. And I recommend Thomas Young's well-temperament if you're playing historical music, that is to say classical music in the Western tradition, and you want to connect with what Chopin really wanted to write when he writes, you know. Because if we play that in G, we lose the drum roll effect that we have in F sharp, right? Every key is different. So if we want to connect to show like the intention of historical composers and be able to play with different color in the music that we're writing or composing, Thomas Young's well-temperament is a really good choice because there's enough contrast that it's quite apparent what was meant. But playing almost anything else, I highly recommend a Victorian temperament. I use Bill Bremer's equal beating Victorian temperament, but there are many others out there. I use a Victorian temperament. So Victorian temperament is much closer to an Equal Temperament, and Bill Bremer's is very, very close. It's not very off from an Equal Temperament, but it's off enough that there's still, the C is more pure, the F sharp is less so, and it's off enough from Equal Temperament that it's still interesting without being off enough to really even be very audible. I'll put some links in the description, but I think you'll see, I think you won't even be able to tell that it's not an Equal Temperament. And yet, if you put the same piece side by side, most people will say, well, I guess I prefer that one without knowing that it's the Victorian one, just because it sounds a little bit more musical, there's a little bit more contrast, it's just a little bit more lively, this piano sounds more alive than Equal Temperament where everything is just clear cut and the same. And basically I would say don't use equal temperament unless what you want to play sounds bad in it. And what you can do is when your piano tuner comes to town, you just say, tune me like a couple of octaves in well-temperament or Victorian temperament, Thomas Young's well-temperament, and I'd like to try it and just try my music. And if I like how it sounds or I'm enjoying exploring it, maybe try it for that year or that 6 months until the piano tuner comes back. Just try it, see if you like it, try something else. For me, it's opened so many doors in terms of how I play the music. I've been exploring the music I used to play, and just been like, wow, like it sounds so different than I remember. This is so interesting. So for me, it's opened all these doors in the piano. I enjoy it so much more. Oh my God, I didn't even realize I'm wearing my Circle of Fifths t-shirt. That is so nerdy. Anyway, so it's just opened, doing Victorian or well-temperaments has opened my eyes to historical music and made it so much more interesting. I never thought Mozart was interesting until I started playing it this way. But even if you're playing modern music, even if you're making up jazz or writing music, that music will be improved by having slight tone, key, color changes in the music. And this could be interesting even for people doing electronic music, because most of the electronic things that we have access to are going to be on some kind of equal temperament, but with digital, there are digital ways to always play in a just temperament. Like I mentioned that there are disadvantages to having things be too harmonic because we lose the expressiveness. So sometimes we want that singing quality of the I can't sing that high. So sometimes we want that singing quality, but anyway, there are ways using digital methods to have different temperaments for our digital instruments as well. I'm not too much of an expert in that, but it's just another possibility that's opened by all this. So hope this has been helpful. Hope it's helped people that own a piano ask more from their piano tuners, because I think that's a good thing. By the way, I used to work as a piano tuner. I used to do it, but I don't do it right now. I'm mostly teaching piano. So I don't have any skin in the game about this. This isn't to promote my business or my way of doing things. It's because I discovered it and found that it's better. And friends have been asking me, well, why? Can you explain why? And I've said, well, I could, but it would take me about 36 minutes and 59 seconds. No, wait, 37 minutes and 03 seconds. Anyway, you get the idea. It would take me a while. And so I wanted to kind of sit down and do my big speech to a camera rather than breaking all of my friends' ears one at a time. So yeah, hope it's been interesting, even for folks that don't have a piano. You've learned more about the theory behind tuning, why we need to temper the piano, why none of these intervals can be pure, why we need to make like the kind of compromises that are inherent in tuning a piano. So hope that explains a bit more of that. So enjoy the music.